Thanks very much, Gerard. And again, thanks for the opportunity to speak here. Given the diversity here, I suppose we'll all come with our own angle. I'm coming from an economics perspective, so this isn't necessarily the most important thing for the country. Maybe it's not even the most important thing that I would think for the country, but given where I'm coming from, it's one issue that's quite important. For those that were perhaps here yesterday, you'll be familiar now that maybe I'd have a tendency to use a lot of numbers. So I think just to start, just to put some of the numbers that will appear over the next 10 minutes in context, we can consider some of the issues from a fiscal perspective. And one thing that's sort of dogged us for the last number of years has been the banking crisis, and just to focus on the cost of it. Now, I think eventually it'll work out at a net cost of around €30 billion, a massive hole put in the public finances as a result of a hole that emerged in our banks. Obviously, we didn't throw that money in up front. We borrowed a lot of it, and at current interest rates, you're probably looking at an upper level of about €1 billion per annum as a cost as a result of that bank bailout. So that €1 billion has obviously generated a lot of reaction, and that sort of, we can use that as an anchor to some of the numbers that come forward. If you wanted something else, we could look at maybe on a more positive perspective. For our 1 million or so children, we spend about €2 billion per annum on child benefit. So they're just sort of some of the scale of some of the things we're looking at. The issue I want to address is the impact, the presence of multinationals in Ireland and how we need to embrace them. Yes, we do, but we also must realise that the rest of the world is coming. We have had great success in it, but we have to be careful where we're going into the future. What are they coming for? Well, obviously we have the visible things like the jobs, coming from jobs announcements, the investment, what these companies are building, their contribution to the construction sector, and equally I'll focus on maybe one that's unseen a bit, their contribution to tax, how much tax they actually pay in Ireland. Who's coming? Well, we don't have to go too far to find out who's coming. Up here in Donegal, we're probably not more than 20 or 30 miles from it, given the discussion about corporation tax in the Northern Ireland. And equally, we see it over in London, the changes George Osborne has made to the corporation tax rate. When he came into power, their rate was 28%. He has promised that it will be down to 18% by the end of the decade. So they clearly are moving into a different zone. We're at 12.5%, still below that. But there are certain attractions that the UK has that we simply can't compete with. One being scale. The size, the diversity over there is far greater than it is here. So what's at stake? If they're coming for it, what might they take from us? Well, clearly we've been very attractive for US multinationals. And if you just focus on US multinationals, and I'm not going to focus on look at what happens in the IFSC, to be honest, I'm not fully sure what goes on in there, but if you look at the rest of the economy, what we might term the business economy, outside of financials, US multinationals have 100,000 staff in Ireland. Each year, those companies pay $6 billion in wages. Every year, $6 billion in wages. Each year, American companies in Ireland spend $3 billion on capital investment, whether it's data centres in Athenry, new factories and facilities in Leixlip with Intel, or pharma or biopharma plants below around Cork. It's $3 billion a year pumped into the economy. That's what the UK are looking to dip their toes into. Who else is coming? The EU countries and the OECD countries are looking at changing tax rules. Every year in Ireland we collect $4 billion in corporation tax. 80% of that comes from foreign companies. More than 3/4 of the corporation tax we collect is not from Irish companies at all. So you might say we have an over-reliance on the multinational sector, and perhaps maybe to the detriment of developing the indigenous sector, but they are huge contributors. 80% of the corporation tax comes from foreign companies. And the EU, the OECD are looking at that. If we take a sector I'm familiar with, given its level of its existence in Cork, the pharmaceutical sector. When it comes to manufacturing pharmaceuticals, 25% of the profit in the EU is taxed in Ireland. That of all the profits made in manufacturing pharmaceuticals in the EU, 1/4 of it is taxable in Ireland. And we collect $700 million every year in corporation tax from the pharmaceutical companies. That's on top of the wages they pay, on top of the services they use, on top of the investment they bring in terms of building things. So it's kind of hidden there in the background. And the EU and the OECD are looking at changing the rules, how they're going to tax it. And the way they're changing it would be hugely to our disadvantage. Wouldn't be on the source of the profits, it'd be on maybe the source of the sales, where the customers are. We might be the source of 25% of the profits from the manufacture of pharmaceuticals in the EU, but we make up 1% of the sales. So if they change the rules, they could hugely erode the tax base in Ireland. And they have this thing called the Common Consolidated Corporate Tax Base, the CCCTB. That's based on sales, employees, investment, etc., not based on the current rules. That would see our tax base fall by 80%. So in that sector alone, we're looking at a loss every year of about 500 million, £500 million, if the rules change. Now, the Americans don't want the rules to change, so maybe that's in our favour. We have the American companies here. But if the rules change, that's potentially what could happen. So when it comes to the multinationals in Ireland, like, we do get the jobs, we do get the investment, but equally we're getting the tax. Yes, obviously our rate is low. We tax it at 12.5%. But 12.5% of a big pot is quite useful for us. So if these things change, well, why are the companies here, of course? Yes, we'll say we're English-speaking, flexible workforce, closest time zone to America, in the Eurozone, whatever it might be, but clearly tax is quite important. And if they can't avail of our 12.5% rate, we mightn't just lose the 500 million in tax every year. We might lose the marginal investment down the line. Clearly there are issues when it comes to corporation tax, and Ireland has attracted a lot of attention over the past while. The European Commission are investigating Ireland in relation to Apple, an investigation that sort of began or had its source in some political grandstanding over in the US Senate, where US politicians hauled in Apple executives and put them under the grill. Now, there was lots of fault to be dished out in the US Senate. It could have been thrown at the US politicians. They weren't going to do it. It could have been thrown at the US executives. The politicians did it small, but obviously the executives accepted no blame. But plenty of it was thrown at Ireland, and a huge amount of it. And that sort of prompted the EU investigation. In essence, the investigation is over. The EU published preliminary findings there last September last year, and they essentially said in the middle of it, the profit was taxed at 12.5%. And that essentially should be the end of it, because the accusation was of special tax rates. If there are special tax rates in Ireland, we may as well pack up and go home, because no companies want to be involved in sort of the negative publicity that comes with that. And it's clear that this investigation hasn't had much of a negative impact, because even in the midst of it, we're seeing more and more investment flowing into Ireland, more and more job announcements. So this EU investigation will be dropped. But I think from a political perspective, they will stretch it out and try to generate uncertainty from it. It is a threat, just like the changes to the rules are a threat. But I think it's one that eventually will peter out. But obviously there will be some political sort of manoeuvring to happen. So if this is an issue, the question about Ireland being at the crossroads, what should we do? An Taoiseach was here earlier and spoke a lot about trying to ending the cycle of bust and boom. We know one issue that can happen if your economy is too dependent on one sector. For us, it was the construction sector. But equally, we're dependent on the multinational sector. Like, what would happen if we were to lose the 100,000 high-paying jobs from the US multinationals? We've seen the impact losing close to 200,000 jobs in construction has had. But what are we doing about removing this cycle of bust and boom? And Taoiseach said it 3 or 4 times, but I didn't hear any specific policies to actually address it. I think we actually should do something to address it. And one thing to do would be to sort of put up a pot of money, to save money for the rainy day. And one source of that could be the corporation tax receipts from these foreign companies, for as long as they're here. We want more of them to be here, we want them to be here as long as possible, but we don't know what the future will bring. So I would propose that rather than just running a balanced budget, which we will get to over the next couple of years, that we go a bit beyond that. That while the economy is performing well, we save a portion of the corporate tax revenue these companies are giving us. Maybe a third, maybe a half. When the economy is performing well, growing at 3, 4, 5%, as we're doing so at the moment. And over time, you'd build up a pot of money. It might be £1 billion, £1.5 billion a year. Over 3, 4 years, you get up to 5, 6, 7 billion. Then, when the next downturn comes, as it inevitably will, you have this discretionary money available, money that you can spend. You're not dependent on bond markets to get you the money. You have it here. So if the government produce growth forecasts that are low, their plan isn't working. Growth drops below 2%. They expect employment to fall. What do? Well, now we spend this money. We ameliorate the boom and bust cycle. If things come into a downturn, we have the money there. And then we spend it, particularly on capital spending when a downturn comes. Build roads, build schools, build hospitals. Build them when you get better value for money. So yes, we do get massive advantages from the presence of the multinationals. I think we can use it. Use it to end this cycle of boom and bust. Look at our fiscal rules and say, this is how we go about doing it. Run our balanced budget, but save a bit for the rainy day. Thanks very much.